Good afternoon. How's everyone doing today? Good, good. Thank you. All right. Well, I am extremely excited. My name is Justice Wadener-Smith, and I have the great fortune of overseeing the Diversity and Inclusion Program for ONEOK. And I'm very honored, I don't even know where the computer is, to be here today at this inaugural dedicated diversity and inclusion event in Tulsa for OK Ethics. Our panelists are absolutely incredible, and I know we're all going to learn a lot from them. OK Ethics is a critical organization in our state. I know ONEOK is very proud to be a supporter of the organization, and I feel very deeply connected to the conversation around ethics and diversity. I feel that these are two topics that are critical to organizations in our community. At ONEOK, ethics and diversity are two of our 5 core values, and we believe they're profoundly intertwined. Our ethics team, especially Pat Sapola and Ken Short, are 2 of our most dedicated partners in our diversity and inclusion efforts, and we seek to be the same for their works in ethics and compliance. My guess is that all of us could have said, when we were talking and playing our game earlier, a common values game, that we share a common goal, and that goal is to have the most ethically grounded, inclusive organizations possible, so that we can have the betterment, not only for our companies, but our communities as well. So that said, I'd like to dive in. I'd like to invite our distinguished panelists to the stage, and if you can join me in welcoming them. So I wanted to begin today's panel by inviting each of our speakers to introduce yourself by way of sharing why the topic of diversity, equity, and inclusion is personally important to you. We'll start with Brian and go down the table for this question. So Brian, if you could please introduce yourself and kick us off.
Okay, thank you, Justice, and thank you to this distinguished panel. I'm honored to be on this panel. Thank you for inviting me. I am Brian Black. I'm the Senior HR Leader for Spirit AeroSystems Oklahoma Operations. Previously to that, I was the Diversity Leader for the company for 8 years and developed the strategy. The reason this is very important to me, I think that it's important that whenever you enter a conversation around diversity that you first set context. I think just with anything you're going to talk about, you have to set the context for the discussion. And I think that when we talk about, for us at Spirit AeroSystems, when you say diversity, it could mean there's multiple dimensions, and so it could mean many things for each individual. But for us, the context that we explore the notion of diversity is very simple. For us, it's any point of difference, how we're the same, and how we're different. And that's how we define diversity. And we do it that way because if you're going to be effective, particularly in a corporate situation, you must build a tent that everyone can get under. And if your definition every time you think you're doing something good in diversity, you can have some unexpected consequences if you don't really think it through. So for us, it's important that every single employee, no matter what the dimension is, whether it's white males, whether it's Native Americans, African Americans, that when we say diversity, the context of that notion is that everyone can get under that tent.
Mm-hmm.
I hope I don't have to follow you all panel long. My name is Tahara Taki. I am an account executive and inclusion specialist at Schnocky Turnbow Frank. No, I am not an attorney. It is a public relations and leadership development firm, and I do inclusion and diversity work across the state. So why inclusion, diversity, and equity is important to me is, on a personal level, I was kind of thrust into that space, being born who I was. As a Muslim, as a Cherokee, and as being white. And I'm an immigrant. I came to Tulsa in 1996, started wearing my hijab, which is my headscarf, in August of 2001 at the age of 7. And as you know, 9/11 happened the following month. And it has been a persistent onflow of discrimination, hatred, and harassment since then. And so it has put me into the position where I can't afford not to be part of this conversation. On the flip side of that, I think that everyone, no matter your identity, should be valued, should be respected, should be loved, and should have equal access to opportunities and have the resources to succeed. And I think right now we still have a long way of going to reaching that inclusion and equity for everyone.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, thanks.
My name is Kuma Roberts. I'm the Executive Director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at the Tulsa Regional Chamber. DEI, to me, very much like Tahara, is something that I've lived my entire life. I was always too dark-skinned for the white population at my school, and too proper speaking and too perfect or assimilated for the blacks. And so I lived in this sort of in-between space, this limbo, where the idea of representation was really important, but I feel really comfortable in a variety of circles. And so the value of diversity and inclusion is that I get to sit at a lot of tables that people, both from a racial standpoint, from a religious standpoint, don't get to sit around. And so it's really quite interesting to be that bridge builder, and I just can't help but want to make sure that the people I surround myself with my community, and with my city, that we're all doing that same thing, and that truly we are exhibiting unity in the community. So pleased to be here.
Good afternoon. My name is Lacey Horn, and I'm the treasurer for the Cherokee Nation. I oversee all financial functions for the Cherokee Nation tribal government, which includes the largest tribally managed healthcare system in the United States. And we're a very integral part of the Tulsa community, the Cherokee Nation, and our entities here. I grew up south of Tulsa in Vian, Oklahoma, so if anybody's familiar with Lake Tenkiller, that's
Right.
That's my home place. So I grew up in my Cherokee grandmother's backyard, as well as my matrilineal grandparents, or my maternal grandparents' backyard, where they lived on their Cherokee land allotment. And so I spent a lot of time outdoors, and I didn't realize until much later that my brain was just wired differently, that I was feeling this interconnectedness with not only the people around me, but with animals and with inanimate objects. You know, I could feel the feelings of a table. And so I took this sense of interconnectedness and have developed through the years an intuition and a sense of how people feel around me and how people are treating others. And so the concept of diversity and inclusion is very important to me, because I've seen it be a negative and a positive in my life and in so many other people's lives. And so in Cherokee culture, especially where women are considered to be equal to men, and I'll speak a little bit about that in a moment, I never understood that I couldn't do exactly what my older brother was doing. If he wanted to go to college, I was going to college. If he wanted to eat 3 servings of mashed potatoes, I was eating 3 servings of mashed potatoes. And so my challenge going out in the real world is seeing this, and so I look forward to bringing my perspectives to you today, and I am very proud to be a part of this distinguished panel, so thank you.
Thanks so much. I'm Roger Ramsire, and I have the privilege to be the market leader for Cox Communications here in Tulsa. We've got about 500 employees, but more importantly, we have a very diverse customer base of almost 200,000 residents and businesses throughout the Tulsa metropolitan area. And in that, diversity is not only important to me because of those 500 employees, each of whom deserve respect and opportunities to progress in their careers, but also because of our customer base and understanding their needs. I am frequently humbled by my nice wife because I don't understand why somebody would need a very specialized cable channel out of the 160 that we offer. If I was a one-man focus group, I would offer 2 channels on Cox, ESPN for NCAA basketball, and CBS only to get to watch Blue Bloods with Tom Selleck. But my wife reminds me I would not make a good focus group, and it's for that reason that by paying attention to the diverse wants and needs of our customer base, that we need to then have a diverse workforce out of our 500 employees each of whom brings something different to the table. I'll finish my part of the introduction by saying that it's also important because you can avoid embarrassing situations that can inhibit your career. This happened a number of years ago when I was in a different role for an international company, and I had a delegation of Chinese coming from Shanghai to come visit in the United States, and I was in charge of this meeting, and at the beginning asked everybody to introduce themselves, and we went down the line, and each of the individuals through cryptic English introduced themselves, and then the last person was not introducing himself, and I said, and my kids make fun of me because I think that people in foreign cultures, I need to talk louder and slower, and maybe the louder I am, they could do it. And I said, would you please introduce yourself? And he looked up at me and he said, I'm George from legal up on the 5th floor. And I about sunk through. I hadn't worked. I'd worked with George on the phone before. He was obviously of Chinese descent. And what an embarrassing moment for me, but what a great lesson it taught, and hopefully you can avoid that same experience. Pleased to be here today.
I just have to say, both Shannon and Roger, your stories, one of the primary things I think around diversity and inclusion is, as you named, that there are times that we all make mistakes, and being able to share them with others, being able to learn from each other is so critical, and being able to recognize and name it is a really important process. And the fact that you both chose to start as the very first out of the gate in front of hundreds of people, kudos. I love that. So as mentioned by Brian, diversity, we wanted to set some context around how the terms diversity and inclusion are really defined. I recognize that all of us may have different definitions of those words, so we wanted to invite a couple of our panelists to kind of explore what the term diversity and inclusion means to them. Brian, you did a beautiful job talking about the wide tent for diversity, and I'm curious if you could dive in a bit on the inclusion aspect.
Sure, thank you. So, I think that part of the conversation has to be that, first of all, we only know what we know, and I don't even know half of what I know. And it's all shaped by our experiences and where you grew up, how you were raised, those kinds of things. And so I think you have to enter the discussion simply understanding that you only know what you know, and someone else knows some things that you might need to know and put a part of your whole framework. But part of it is that we have to have the discussion around, just because we are talking about inclusion, it doesn't mean someone else has to give up. And I think that's where you get into a pull and a tug situation when a particular group perceives, because the dimension of diversity we're talking about at that particular time, they may not be a part of that dimension, that I have to give up so that she can move up. And if that's the dynamic that you're having, then you will never get to a real inclusive workforce. The way I like to describe it at Spirit Aerosystems is that when we recruit and we get folks on the team, it's great to be on the team, but it gets a little boring if you're always on the sidelines. And so the real challenge is, how do you get everyone off the sidelines and into the game? And the only way they can get into the game is that they must understand the rules and understand what the unwritten rules are. And oftentimes you cannot get in the game, or even if you get in the game, you cannot play well if the rules are not transparent and are provided for everyone. My experience has been, when everyone has that opportunity to play and there is no barriers to get into the game and the rules are clear, then the inclusion process goes better, but it only goes great when we're very intentional about it. So we can't just step back and say, well, okay, now play. But in every situation, if we're not intentional about it as well, then we're fooling ourselves. So that's my view on it.
Thank you. Lacey, would you mind sharing your response to that question?
Sure. So modern business psychology is talking a lot today about the concept of cognitive diversity. And so a good definition that I found for cognitive diversity is the inclusion of people who have different ways of thinking, different viewpoints, and different skill sets in a team or business group. In the Cherokee way of life, we've been practicing cognitive diversity and diversity and inclusion since time immemorial. So in pre-colonial Cherokee culture, it was well known that people filled the roles that they were best suited to fill based upon the talents and skill sets that our Creator uniquely endowed each of us with. So in other words, we let people do what they do best. We let people be who they were. If you were a woman and you wanted to go out and hunt, you were a woman who went out and hunted. If you were a man who wanted to stay home and take care of kids, you were a man who stayed home and take care of kids. You weren't judged or excluded because you thought differently. You were valued for it. And this was true amongst the genders as well, because we're historically a matrilineal society. We just understood that there was a needed natural balance between men and women. So I grew up with my mother discussing this concept with me regularly, how everyone was created differently and how everyone's makeup and individual perspective was valid. So families, communities, organizations, we can all work better if we can all recognize that everyone happens for a reason. Even that challenging person at work serves a positive function if you stop for just a moment to look at them through a positive lens. So are they making something better somehow? Are they making you a better person? I used to work with an extremely challenging woman who was very different from me. She was very, very smart and very combative towards me. And so whenever I would see her, and it was most often in a public setting, she would just pummel me with questions. And so at first I just thought this was just really annoying. But then I saw her for what her positive aspect was and what she was bringing out for me. She was sharpening my skills, my intellect, my wit. She made me be on my A game constantly, which made me better. And so if we can just suspend our own judgments and fears about other people and seek to accept them as uniquely endowed with their own special gifts, we can begin to embrace the benefits of diversity both individually and collectively in our organizations.
Thank you. One of my favorite quotes is by a diversity and inclusion thought leader named Joe Gerstant, who has actually been to Tulsa multiple times, so some of you have maybe seen him. But I loved his the quote that says, "If we are not intentionally including, we are excluding." And I think that back to the comment, Brian, that you had made around intentionality and how critical it is, that was powerful. So now that we've explored a bit kind of the differences and the ways that we can look at the words diversity and inclusion, I'd love to hear from a few of our panelists about why it's important for organizations to proactively make efforts toward becoming fully diverse, equitable, and inclusive. And I'm curious, please, Roger, if you would kick us off on that one.
You bet. Great question, and this is where the rubber meets the road. This is where it's hot, because we all want to, most of us want to respect others, but yet there are things that can inhibit that. For instance, at Cox, in telecommunications, we are a traditional male-dominated organization. The whole telecommunications industry is. So we are making very intentional efforts to try to get more gender diversity within our field operations team. But there are natural inhibitors, like the fact I've got more than 100 trucks out on the streets of Tulsa every day. You see them with the Cox logos. They all have a ladder on top of them that you see. But we are doing poorly at gender diversity, and as a company that is trying very, very hard to increase all aspects of diversity, that ladder is a very heavy one, and so we have made a financial commitment to replace all of our ladders, and there will be safety benefits as well, with a hyperlight ladder that should be much easier to handle and will at least not be a natural barrier to things. So it's education and awareness and letting our employees raise these kinds of issues. We've also established a diversity council to raise awareness. And as a matter of fact, at a meeting last week, the head of our diversity council, an African-American lady who has been a great leader for us, said to me, you know, Roger, there is ignorance and stupidity, and we need to do a better job of stamping out both. Ignorance is not knowing about what to do. Stupidity is knowing and not doing it.
Very good. That's great.
Kuma.
Am I going to have to go behind you? No. The question is exactly what I'm hired to do at the Tulsa Regional Chamber, is really try to elevate our region and make more companies and more individuals within our community really understand the business case for diversity, equity, and inclusion. So often we hear that it is the right thing to do, and it absolutely is the right thing to do. But when I'm talking with economic development site selectors, when I'm talking with employers that are looking to expand, employers who are looking to relocate to Tulsa, it's the smart thing to do.
Absolutely.
And if you don't think that Amazon or Google or Microsoft or some of these large companies aren't looking at Oklahoma and other states and trying to figure out how inclusive, how equitable, how diverse the communities they'd be moving their employees into, then you'd be sorely wrong. And so often on the map, Tulsa and Oklahoma is a no, because the perception of our policies, the perception of our mindset here is that we do not value and or appreciate diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so the purpose of Mosaic, the purpose of events like this, and the idea and the concepts and the values around Oklahoma ethics are all about lifting that up to make sure that people know that there are people that truly care about ensuring that everyone feels welcomed and everyone feels like they belong. And we certainly want Tulsa to be world-class in that respect. And so that's the value of why any organization would want to lift up these efforts. Thanks.
Absolutely. So I want to turn a little bit into kind of thinking about us as individuals, and that the fact that really diversity and inclusion, living it, builds on positive character traits that I would imagine many, if not all of us, seek to cultivate. But being human beings, we are bound to have lapses and mistakes. We've already had a couple mentioned today. I'm curious what some of the common barriers are that you all believe keep us from achieving inclusiveness. And Tahara, I'd love to start with you.
Absolutely. So I think that there are quite a few barriers that keep us from achieving that inclusiveness. Let's say that we all understand what inclusion and diversity is. We understand and we say that as individuals we value inclusion and diversity. There are still some common barriers, and I'll mention 3 of them. One of them is resistance to change or lack of support. It's difficult for many who are in the majority, and the majority can be in any environment who makes up that population as a majority, to see the need to or the want to change. And with change, people want to know what's in it for them. So you have to explicitly state what is in it for you. On the other side, there might be lack of support. Inclusion and diversity work needs support from top-down leadership, but it also needs support from ground up. And if top-level leadership doesn't truly value inclusion and diversity, others in the organization will see right through those efforts, and it won't have any sort of success in the organization. But on the other side, if there is no support from the ground up, or if inclusion and diversity efforts are being forced down on employees, then there can be backlash, and inclusion also will not be achieved. So there's not this is all a journey. There's no one-size-fits-all plan, which is why this is very, very challenging work. A second barrier I find is that a lot of people are unaware of their unconscious or implicit biases and the impact that those biases have. So although we are in a room with fantastic people, everyone in this room has biases. Everyone on this panel has biases, and we shouldn't feel shame or guilt for those biases. There are psychological reasons that we have those biases. We have millions of pieces of information that we are deciding every single day, and so our brain has developed these ways of processing information and developing associations so that we can adequately make decisions. But the challenge is that some implicit biases can negatively impact others through our words, through our actions, and through our behaviors. But most people are not aware of what their implicit biases are, and so they therefore don't know the actions they can take to mitigate those biases. So I'm going to make a quick, go do this afterwards. Take the implicit association test if you have not. Go online, Google implicit association test. It was created in 1990 by scientists and researchers from Harvard University, University of Washington, and University of Virginia, and it is the standard for how you figure out what some of your implicit biases are. I highly recommend that everybody take that test. And then the third barrier is communication barriers, and this is either lack of communication or miscommunication. On the individual side, we often run away from difficult or uncomfortable conversations because we don't obviously want to be uncomfortable, but those are the exact conversations that we need to have in order to make impact in this space. On an organization side, when organizations are starting inclusion and diversity initiatives and efforts, they often will tell employees what they're doing, but they won't explain why or how they're doing it. And the why and how is so vital if you want to get buy-in and you want to get support and engagement from your employees.
Please.
You sparked something to me when you said that, and I just want to say this. So everybody in the room, it's like you say, it's nice to be in a room with everyone who are coming to diversity with a similar context, but I just want to challenge us all. Remember that other view is diverse view as well. And it may be challenging for you sometimes. Even the racist view is a view I don't agree with, and I may not agree with those, but the only way we can actually move by that, those of us who I like to call diversity champions, when we're in that situation, we can't shut them down and say, we actually have to listen to that and walk through it and build our capabilities to walk through and have productive dialogue even with that view that we simply don't agree with, because it is an opinion and it's their opinion. But what I've experienced is if you can build your capability to walk through that, it's interesting how people can change, but we can't, but if we shut that conversation down, and I often get that at Spirit Aerosystems, well, they said, well, that's their view, and they have a right to that view. No, I don't agree with it either, but that's their view. But if we're gonna be true diversity champions, we can't be seen shutting the conversation down. We have to be the ones that build our capabilities to help the conversation, to help people to continue to have productive dialogue so that people can move past some of those views. I just needed to say that.
And I'm glad you did, Brian, because people are just naturally inclined to include people, to gravitate towards people who are, quote, like themselves, right? We all kind of want to hit that easy button, right? Because believing that someone has common habits, tendencies, backgrounds is similar to you, those perceived similarities make it easier to gravitate towards them. So on contrast, if you perceive someone to be very different from you, you perceive that to be more of a challenge in making a connection with them. So again, coming back to the easy button, so most humans, we naturally choose the path of least resistance. We don't want to make things too difficult on ourselves. And what Brian, and I think what we're trying to spur, is this concept of it doesn't have to be so difficult. You don't have to overthink it so much. We've gone through this exercise earlier about building all of these lists of commonalities that each of our tables have. We each have a lot more commonalities than we have differences, but ultimately we are unique expressions of our own selves. So when we talk about bringing change to organizations, obviously it's really set at a tone at the top. And so I consider myself a person of diverse background that would be an excellent corporate board member. And so when I express my interest in being a corporate board member, I get a really positive response. People are like, oh, your background is great, your credentials, you're a woman, you're a Cherokee, and so you check all these diversity boxes. But then they look at me and they say, but you're just too young. And so, it's these irrational double standards that I see so often impacting people like myself and other people too. It's these unwritten rules, because this concept of not being diverse enough or not being diverse in the way that we want you to be diverse. When a truly qualified candidate presents against a status quo candidate, the diverse candidate is held to this unwritten, imperceptible double standard.
Come on, sister.
Mm-hmm. And I see this being one of the biggest barriers to diversity and inclusion.
So one of the most challenging issues, I think, that impacts both the diversity and inclusion space and the space around ethics is how current events and how our culture show up in the workplace. I'm curious if you would share what you believe some of the top issues in today's culture are that are having the biggest impact on workplace dynamics as related to diversity, ethics, and inclusion. And Kuma, could we begin with you?
You know, this is a great question, and every one of the panelists have hit on it. It's this desire for us to be very comfortable and not you know, and hide behind our computer screens, to be bold and discriminatory and offensive when your name doesn't have to be attached to it. This idea that you can live your life, however exclusionary that might be, you know, as long as no one knows, I can engage in policies that may or may not acknowledge my own personal biases. All of those things are things that are impacting the workplace today. We absolutely must become more comfortable with being uncomfortable. And that means having hard conversations with people when they constantly are creating microaggressions against you. When women are always left to pick up after the meeting, well, why is that? You know, we have to be able to say to people, speak truth to power in many ways, and just begin to push a little bit harder instead of just relying on, I'm going to be quiet, I'm just going to do my job, I'm just going to walk away. Because when nothing changes, And so one of those things, for instance, today, just before I came in here, there was a propaganda sign, a la, you know, World War II era, that's been posted just downtown here on the south side of the Performing Arts Center that literally said the words, "Diversity destroys nations." This is a constant fight, this rhetoric, this division that we are facing. And every day we make choices, like Tahara said, and we have to make all of these decisions. And when it comes to diversity, equity, inclusion, we must be super intentional and make the decision to fight against people that are trying to divide that. And so in the workplace, when you're thinking about your policies, your hiring policies, your religious accommodation, how you are accommodating people with disabilities, racial, cultural, all of these factors, you are saying to the people that you are attracting to your workplace, you're saying to your existing employees that we value these things and they make a huge difference, and that is how we are successful. And so current events plays an extreme role, but we really have to address these conversations head on, and it has to be delivered from the top down. I want my CEO, I want the head of our city, I want people to be talking about these things and not uncomfortable with bringing them to me and to my coworkers, because that shows me leadership, that's demonstrative, and I love that. And so I'm seeing a lot more of that in our city, and it's very, very exciting. But we are in challenging times, and we have to be ever vigilant. So thank you.
Preach.
Let me add something to my sister, what she just said. You know, I'm about to get up and dance here in a minute. Make America great again. Kuma, you really hit a real important point. And those of you who are, whether you're corporate or whatever organizations that you're leading, we're kidding ourselves if we don't think this stuff doesn't come to work. And so one of the things we've been doing at Spirit Aerosystems is running a program that we call Taking Flight that's all about building people's capability to walk through that. So if you're not doing anything, I think that's if you're saying, hey, diversity and inclusion, we're all about it as a company, you really need to think about what strategies are you doing to help your employees walk through this. We can pretend like it's not going on, but it is. And what I've seen over the 9 years we've been doing that is that when these things happen, it's interesting, you know, as HR, you know, everything comes to HR, but it's interesting how employees are bringing us the issues, they're figuring it out and how they're gonna have a conversation, they're checking in, and I'm just amazed at their capability over a period of time. So people have more capability than sometimes we give them credit to. But as leaders in organizations, we've got to, I always tell my team, we have to create the space. Once we create the space, then allow the dialogue.
Absolutely. Creating space and allowing dialogue. I love that. Tahara, do you have any thoughts on this question?
Absolutely. I think, as Kuma mentioned and as Brian mentioned, there's a lot of tension in society right now. You can see that anytime that you watch the news. You can see it anytime you look on social media. I've definitely seen my Netflix queue change and shift over time from the more serious shows to like Great British Baking Show for more comical reactions so I can wind down. But we bring a lot of that tension, that fear, that anxiety into the workplace, whether consciously or unconsciously. And I think it's important that leaders, that managers, supervisors are aware that what is happening outside of the walls is coming inside. People may not be explicitly saying something about it, but they're feeling it. And I think racial issues, sexual orientation debates, immigration policies, politics, when it comes to shooting against minorities in the community, all of that is having a direct impact on workplace dynamics. Two of the ones that I'll mention that have definitely had an impact on me are xenophobic comments and the Me Too movement. So xenophobic rhetoric, this often translates into anti-Muslim rhetoric. And so the impact of that is those that are or that appear to be Muslim or Arab are characterized as being worthy of suspicion, of discrimination, of harassment, of surveillance, of profiling. And this bias against Muslims will lead to impacts such as hostile work environments, violence, denied promotions, hiring discrimination. Most recent example, we all heard about what happened in Christchurch, New Zealand, and that was huge. I definitely felt the impact of that. I know a lot of the people in my social justice community felt the impact. I got a lot of supportive messages. But then you have an Australian senator come out and say, oh, it was against Muslims this time, but they're usually the causes of it. You know what? We need to block immigration. These people don't need to be in our country anymore. And the impact of that coming from leadership. And the amount of hate crimes towards Muslims, not only in New Zealand, not only in Europe and across the world, but also here in Oklahoma, here in the US, have risen after that terrorist attack in New Zealand. And so getting supportive messages from my boss and from leadership meant a huge amount to me. It showed me that the people I work for truly value me. They truly value my identity. And I think the more you can do that in your work environment, the more you will make people want to stay, the more loyal they will be to your organization, the more included they will feel in the organization. On the Me Too movement, gender dynamics and how they play out in the workforce have finally been given some national attention. It is long overdue. Employees and employers are becoming increasingly aware of the issues when it comes to discrimination, sexism, and harassment within the workplace, whether it's overt or whether it's subtle. And so I think that the Me Too movement has been instrumental in helping us break away from hiding from that conversation and bringing it to the forefront. But I think that now we need to find ways and create solutions for how we change these behaviors and have accountability for action. And I think that this transformation has to include both men and women working together on these solutions if we want any sort of impact long term.
Roger, I'd love to invite you to answer this one as well.
I think it was President Kennedy that said we fear what we do not know. And you've heard from the other panelists the thought of having a conversation. I have found that to be of incredible value, and for those of you who've had the chance to hear our Oklahoma Senator James Lankford, he is constantly challenging all the constituents with whom he meets to have a meal, break bread with somebody from a different race, invite them into your home. And I echo that because it is amazing when you start to know somebody, you don't fear them as much. But when you're at a distance, it does make it hard. The statement was made about the sign, Kuma, about diversity, destroying nations. And yet, as much as I've learned and what I've seen in our company and in my community, diversity to me brings nations together instead, because you find out after breaking bread with someone, hey, they are not so different, or they have differences from which I could learn and incorporate into my own life. And then you are sometimes surprised. This panel met earlier to get to know each other and talk through things. I've had the privilege to know Brian Black for about 2 decades, actually, in our former lives.
I'm his baby brother. He's old.
In a different city. And yet I did not know until he shared it with us recently, he's got a little Irish blood in him.
Yeah.
Now, you might not think of that, but how fascinating to understand these unique things that you just can't judge a book by its cover, whether it was the Chinese descendant lawyer who I embarrassed myself in front of, or anyone else.
I love it. Curiosity, it really brings up, I think, the concept of curiosity. And when we're curious, and this concept of sitting across the table with someone, breaking bread, what about when we're sitting across the table with maybe a disagreeable relative at Thanksgiving or a disagreeable coworker? What do you all recommend as some of the most important things to remember when approaching a potentially sensitive conversation and as we seek to learn and grow together? Lacey, would you like to kick us off?
Sure. So remaining calm is my go-to strategy. For 5 years, I did government relations for Cherokee Nation, and I traveled back and forth to Washington, D.C. and wherever congressmen were meeting, and often these interactions with the congressmen occurred in social settings where they would have their spouses there and their families. And so one particular congressman's wife, she used to take particular pleasure in the cocktail party circles, asking me questions, and she would say, "You're Cherokee? You don't look Cherokee. How much Cherokee are you?" And she also had no understanding whatsoever why Indian tribes existed at all. So those were particularly fun questions too. So rather than getting upset or acting offended, I recognized her questions as triggers, not triggers for me to feel hurt, but triggers for me to invoke my compassion for her lack of understanding, and a challenge for me to help educate her and potentially change her perspective. I chose to see the opportunity as these ways to create understandings among us and between us, and I chose to disable that scrappy high school girl from Vian, Oklahoma that would have liked to just sass right back in her face. So let's face that. So in doing so, I created a relationship with her over the years that I do believe changed her perspective on Native Americans and why we exist here in the United States. But I can't say anything about her combative party manners. So.
Kuma, how about you?
It's a hard question, right? Because it's a trigger thing, exactly as you explained. I mean, it can set off. I've had so many frustrating conversations with people that are, whether they know it or not, are triggering me in some way, saying something that, quite frankly, as a woman, as a woman of color, there are just so many. It's exhausting. Let's just be honest. And so, in those situations, I try to take the high road. I don't always do it, so I don't want to say that I'm perfect. But I think listening, and responding. And in that order, think, listen to what they're saying, and then respond. So often, people can be disrespectful, disagreeable, however you want to say it, and you can fail to listen to them. And sometimes that's all people need, is just to be heard in many ways. Not that you have to agree, like Brian said, not that you have to get on the bandwagon, but hear them out and hope that they will do the same for you. So in those situations, usually, I'm surprised. Usually we might not come to some kumbaya moment, but typically we can come to some understanding where we agree to disagree. And we can, in the future, move forward and have other productive conversations and not ones where I'm just angry and I see red every time I look at you in your face. And so I think that we need to be surprised more often, and we need to put ourselves in situations where we allow that to happen. So.
That's right.
Mm-hmm. Tahara?
Great question. Similar to these ladies, I've also experienced a lot of questions in personal settings as well as a lot of my private settings as well, professional. I think the first thing for me that I always go into those conversations with is you can always tell if somebody has a positive intent with their question. And you can always gauge whether they're really interested in understanding and getting some awareness, or whether they're trying to push those buttons and trigger you. If it's the second, when they're trying to push those buttons and trigger you, the first thing that's really important for me is ensuring my physical and my psychological safety. I always say that you should be able to push the feelings of being uncomfortable if it's just because you don't want to have a difficult conversation. But I would never engage in a dialogue if I felt unsafe or like I could be physically or emotionally harmed in some way. And so I think that's always paramount anytime you're in those situations. Keep that physical and that psychological safety first and top of mind. Beyond that, very similar to what Kuma said, it's a dialogue. It's not about having a debate with someone. You should go into a conversation with the intention to hear, not to be heard. And what I mean by that is really double down and focus on listening to what the other person is saying and understanding their perspective. As Brian also mentioned, you might not have the same perspective and you might not agree with what they're saying. You might have the absolute opposite perspective. That's okay. Listen to what they're saying, understand where their perspective is coming from, ask them questions of why do you think that, and try and understand where, if you can find common ground, fantastic. If you can't, agree to disagree. These conversations about diversity, inclusion, and equity, it's not about changing your personal values. It's about understanding that people have different values, and that's okay. We just want to be in a place where we respect, we value, and we appreciate everyone and their different viewpoints.
You really touched me when you talked about the psychological, and I just wanted to mention this about that. So whose job is diversity and inclusion? Is there people out there, diversity manager or something like that? Oh, it's just a few of us here. Okay, but here's the thing I want to say to people who work in this field. Because when I was the diversity leader for Spirit for 8 years, I was in therapy. And here's why. To protect my own psychological, because this stuff can get real deep. Sister, I'm seeing you do this every day. But if you're going to be effective in this, I mean, you really do have to take care of your psychological, because it's almost, in some situations, I consider it psychological violence that sometimes when people just, and if you're the diversity leader, you're getting it from all kinds of ways. And I went to EAP, and it really helped me. So I just say that to take care of yourself. Sometimes we try to take care of everybody, Shannon, but take time to take care of yourself as you're doing this work. Because it can be very exhausting, and you're giving and you're giving and you're giving until there's nothing left to give. You got to take care of yourself. You got to take care of your family. Don't let this impact that part of who you are.
And if I can add, as a diversity and inclusion professional, so I have my incredible team of folks that I get to work with every day here, and a few of us are dedicated full-time diversity and inclusion folks, but every one of you are leaders in the diversity and inclusion efforts. And so one thing I will say is it can be really, really exhausting, as we know, and how to just support each other. So go back, if you have a D&I professional in your organization, and high-five them. Yeah. Show them some love. Show them some love. So we are almost, I can't believe that we're almost at time, but I wanted to wrap up with some of the actionable takeaways. And we have a wide gamut of professionals, business owners, leaders, our students here today. And in closing, I'd like to invite each of you to share the single most important thing you feel an individual can do, as well as one best practice that you believe an organization can undertake to promote diversity and inclusion. And I'd love to start, Roger, with you, and we'll come back up the line for the final question.
I'm going to violate your rules and give a quick couple, but I'll promise to be quick. So the overarching thing is education and awareness. And under that umbrella of education and awareness is taking real, tangible benefits. Look, it is a competitive world in business out there, and competition keeps us getting up early in the morning. I've had the privilege in a former life to see what's going on in other parts of the world, and The challenges related to diversity and inclusion, we've got to quickly get over because the train of value creation is leaving the station, but we have to take real and tangible steps to make sure that it's not an issue that keeps the train in the station. Those steps at Cox have included things like making sure that our interview panels are diverse. Had recently a very, very sharp, longtime black employee, female, who went into an interview panel of 3 middle-aged white guys. Okay, I am very confident that they judge her for her abilities, her skills, and her knowledge, but yet I bet you $100 that made her uncomfortable. So the fact of the matter is, trying to get more diverse interview panels, trying to do outreach to markets to attract them to your business. Every night now at 10 o'clock since January 1st, on our little Cox Channel 3, our local channel, we are broadcasting a Hispanic newscast, locally produced, of high quality. Guess what's happening? We are all of a sudden getting hordes of new Hispanic customers that we didn't get before because we are now pursuing very specific outreach and tactics to those communities. And then I said education and awareness, and I'll finish on this. Part of it is learning from the past. I quoted President Kennedy earlier. I think it was President Truman who said, if we don't learn from history, we are destined to repeat it. So we have a very big thing coming up in this community in 2021, the centennial of the Tulsa Race Massacre. There is so much we can all learn from that, and to that end, I'll finish with a commercial if I'm allowed to do that. On that same dinky little Cox Channel 3 tonight at 8 p.m. and twice on Saturday, we are broadcasting a locally produced 20-minute video documentary produced by Hannibal Johnson, a local historian, author, and attorney who did an incredible job putting together this 20-minute documentary called Remembering Black Wall Street. And there are so many things you can learn from that and enhancing that education and awareness.
So whether or not you're in a position of power influence at your organization, you have opportunities daily to set the tone for inclusiveness, to set the tone for equality. And in 2013, my team and I researched gender pay equity at Cherokee Nation. We wanted to ensure that men and women were receiving equal pay for equal work based upon their background, experience, et cetera. And several changes were made in our pay scales at that point in time. And so now every time a pay scale comes forward for review, we have this as part of our routine review checklist. We took one step to make a change, and now that change is permanently embedded in our procedure. I'm a big believer that you can change a belief. I change my beliefs all the time based upon new information that presents itself. And so my hope today is that you will change a belief. You will learn about the value of diversity and take 1 step, 2 steps, 3 steps, and then keep moving forward until you don't even remember a day where you saw someone for being, quote, to this or to that, or a different race or background or disability. You will believe that everyone has value. Everyone has a unique perspective to offer with uniquely endowed talents because everyone happens for a reason.
Awesome.
Well, as an individual, I would say self-assess constantly. Take the implicit bias test that Tahara recommends. Read a book that maybe you wouldn't pick up. I love that Frederick Douglass is down here, but beyond that, there's so many books around diversity, inclusion, cultural competence. There's just a whole world out there, and build up your knowledge about that and self-assess yourself. Because like she says, bias lives in all of us. I've identified my own biases. I might have more, but I think there's so much value in at least knowing where you stand and then kind of trying to work through that. I mean, we're all a work in progress. The one best practice that I think any organization can undertake as it relates to this work is measure what matters. I love that Roger talked about that they have this Hispanic show on Channel 3, and it's really drawn in. I think as a Chamber of Commerce, we had a real intentionality around increasing our board diversity. And for us, it was easiest to increase that diversity with women. So we really went in, and we know that we have a 47% women board of directors. But now our sights are on visible diversity in terms of ethnic and racial diversity. So we want to make sure that we're measuring the things that matters and really being intentional about it. So as an organization, just identifying where it is that you have lack, and then creating strategies around how to build that. And certainly there's a lot of resources to help you do that. Those are the things I would suggest, the one thing you could each do and take to your organizations.
That's great.
I'm going to mirror a lot of what Kuma said. No, you're good. We just think alike. On the individual side, find out what your biases are. That's the most important thing that you should go back and start with. And then from there, surround yourself with people who are different. They look different. They think different. Engage yourself in building relationships with a diverse group of friends. Get to know people outside of your circle. Go watch movies that have culturally different people in them, which there are a lot more of those coming out. Read books by people who are different from you and just get a broader understanding of different people's perspectives. I think that's the first thing. I would also say that if you're here today, you're already on that path towards understanding and being part of courageous conversations, which is phenomenal. I'm going to plug for you, Kuma. Attend Mosaic meetings.
Yes.
Kuma does a fantastic job every month of bringing speakers in, having those from the community come in and talk about different issues of inclusion and diversity. And those are free meetings in the morning. So take advantage of those opportunities and those resources that you have in the community to continue that learning environment. On the organization side, I think it's critical that if you are starting in this process of inclusion and diversity, or even if you're already in that journey, you need to have a benchmark or a baseline to know where you start. So we always recommend doing an audit or assessment. So if you are trying to implement anything, you need to have some way that you can measure any sort of success to show that ROI. And so we always recommend that audit and assessment. And that can include everything from interviewing your employees to see about engagement levels to interviewing your other stakeholders. It could include reviewing your vendor and supplier information to see if you are diversifying those vendors and suppliers. It can look at HR policies, your current hiring practices, your talent recruitment efforts, where are you advertising. All of that information should be included in the assessment, and that will give you some actionable steps for a long-term implementation plan for how you can succeed in your organization.
First of all, let me just say ditto to all of that. I mean, this is a brilliant panel.
And Brian, you're lightning round. You're lightning round. I love you.
Am I?
Yeah, you are. Remember how we said?
Okay, all right.
Okay.
We right here.
Okay.
So on an individual level, I'm going to challenge everyone to do this. Be willing to go past the familiar and forgive the awkwardness of the moment. Be willing to go past the familiar. I came up with this when I was drinking margaritas on the beach. And I tell my staff all the time, Carla Holmes is here from my team, be willing to go past the familiar and forgive the awkwardness of the moment as a framework. The other thing, as an individual, I challenge you to do, this is a real fun thing you can do, get a group of folks together. First, agree that you're going to view the movie Crash. How many people have seen the movie Crash? Okay. If you haven't seen it, see it by yourself first, and you're going to feel certain things. Then get a diverse group and multiple dimensions when it's my context. If you have some females, have some African Americans, get you a different group and watch that movie together and have a discussion. And I'll just leave that, and it's gonna and you'll have a good discussion. The last thing from an organizational standpoint I will say is that it starts with leadership, and it's about your culture. So all these things my colleagues said need to be done. If the culture is not such that for that to happen, then it's not going to happen. And who develops the culture are the leaders. Culture is the way we do things around here. And so you must have an accountability process for your leaders. You've got to start there. You've got to be able to clearly articulate your business case. When someone asks you, why are we doing this? It's not, it is clearly articulate what is the business case from the CEO all the way down. And then the last thing I would say, once that's in place, because I was the diversity leader for years, and we couldn't do that. And it was very difficult to do that. You'll get pushback from all these other places if the culture is not right to have the discussion. So it's all about timing and where you're on your culture, and you can't get there with all levels of leadership. It's nice to have the CEO on board, but if those first level managers that manage those employees every day is not there, you got to deal with that, because that's where the problem is. It's never been an issue with the executives in this work that I've been. It's always been middle management and first line management that will get in your way. So they have to clearly understand this is the culture, and they are held accountable, and they are exited if they don't want to be in that particular culture. Okay, that's just my thing. The last thing I will say is this. As an organization, wherever you are, and we call it speak out at Spirit Aerosystems, speak up, speak out. Whether it's you or someone else, even if it's not happening to you, you have an obligation to speak out.
All right, let's do it. Big round of applause for our panelists.